This is INCISION, and as you can tell, this is one of the old-school inspired shooters that we're seeing quite a few of these days, and I'm not going to complain about that because most of the time they're pretty fun, and, well, I appreciate a lot of the shooters from that era, so I definitely don't mind more people actually trying to go back and iterate on that formula because there were a lot of really good shooters back then. So, yeah, the whole boomer shooter thing that's going on right now is not something that I have any complaints about, and I wanted to take a look at some. So, INCISION is going for more of the Quake model, I would say. It's in terms of how it feels and how it looks, it's probably closest to Quake of all of the classic shooters that these tend to be inspired by. It's got that sort of heaviness, it's a little bit weighty, but it's also still pretty fast. Some people have mentioned that the movement speed is actually too fast, and personally I don't think so. Your sprint is certainly really speedy, but honestly, I feel like maybe the people that are leveling that complaint at the game haven't actually played it to the end of this episode yet, because that speed is pretty much necessary once a couple of the later monsters get introduced, and I think it's actually got a pretty good pace to it. But the first thing we really have to talk about is the visual style and the overall atmosphere of the game, and atmosphere is really the active word here because the most special thing about this game, in my personal view, is the atmosphere that it creates, because it's going for a sort of, it feels almost post-apocalyptic, but rather than the more normal kinds of post-apocalyptic that you see, instead everything is made of flesh. Everything is flesh and rust, there is metal, there is stone, there is bone, and there is skin everywhere, and the whole aesthetic of the entire game overall is very dingy and gross and fleshy, and I love that sort of thing. I tend to find that some of the most effective horror for me is like body horror, you know, like biomechanical stuff tends to be really disturbing and unsettling in a lot of ways for me, so pretty much all the enemies in this game are biomechanical in some fashion. They are reformed things that probably used to be people but are now all sorts of other things, including the really creepy things that are just teeth that come after you with all sorts of hooks attached to their body and just this big, like, rictus grin permanently. There's some really disturbing stuff in this game. I should probably mention, if you are squeamish or you're not a fan of blood, then this is most definitely not the game for you, because it's not very far into the game before you are wading through literal lakes of blood, walking across like a map entirely constructed of undulating flesh beneath your feet. It is really gross stuff. And I honestly really have to give it to the developer for their atmosphere building, because it's one thing to make a sort of, a body horror game with lots of fleshy stuff, but it's an entirely different thing to actually make a really, really effective atmosphere out of it, because you can make things look all gross, and there are plenty of games that have done that, but a lot of the times it doesn't have that much impact because everything looks so gross you just kind of get used to it and it's not really that big of a deal. But because of the combination of the really gross visual style of this game and the really atmospheric industrial tracks that are happening in the background, this game's overall theming ends up feeling extremely oppressive and closed in and mysterious and just disgusting in a lot of very good ways, because that's clearly what they're going for, right? Speaking of what they're going for, one of the other things they're going for is absolute purity in design, by which I mean this is going for the old-school inspired shooter thing that is as faithful to the old-school shooters as possible, so you don't have things like an experience system or multiple ammo types or weapon upgrades or spells or character skills or any of those things, even though I tend to very much enjoy those things as someone that loves RPGs and really enjoys RPG elements in other games. I also have to admit I can very much enjoy the purity of games like this, because hey, I'm a big fan of Doom, I'm a really big fan of Blood, so I also, as much as I like those things, I also understand the pure gameplay, the very nice feel that can come from not having any of those flashy things and just focusing on a very simple experience. As much as I personally love extra mechanics like that, not every game needs them, and it's fun to play a game that has decided to go without them on purpose for a more purity in design kind of perspective, to just create something very faithfully old school, something kind of like Dusk that feels like it actually could have come out at that time, basically, rather than having too much modern stuff in it as well that could kind of muddy up the theme. There's definitely something to be said about just pure simplicity in design, and this game definitely goes for that. Your weapons are all very simple and very expected, barring one of them. Although all weapons do have an alt fire to use, which is always fun. I definitely love it when games include that. That is one particularly somewhat newer feature that I always love included. The game's pistol is a little bit different than your usual FPS pistol because it's very powerful. It's a Magnum revolver, but of course that means it's got a lot of recoil, and it doesn't have very much ammo, so it doesn't quite work like your usual kind of standby, weak but infinite ammo kind of thing. It's actually a pretty strong weapon. You just have to get used to aiming it because it's very precise. You've also got the quad shotgun. That's very important because one of the metrics to judge an old school inspired shooter by is how good is the shotgun, and in this case, it is a good shotgun. It is actually very fun to use. It normally just chunks enemies into pieces pretty effectively. It is, of course, very effective at close range, as you would expect, but I've found that they've went with a somewhat more realistic depiction of shotguns and actually made it pretty effective at range as well, which I always appreciate. And its alt-fire shoots all 4 barrels in very quick succession, which is very fun and can just shred through large hordes of enemies. You've also got some other weapons like a double-barreled machine gun that has a really nice firing rhythm to it that I find really fun to use. It's also surprisingly precise, and its alt-fire is like an incendiary grenade. And some other fun stuff like, of course, a rocket launcher, because you have to have a rocket launcher in a gun like this, and it is very fun to use, although it does do a tremendous amount of self-damage, so you gotta be careful with it. You've also got a minigun, which is really fun to use because it just totally shreds things in a really, really satisfying way, and I like the fact that its ammo is not measured in individual rounds, but is instead measured in yards of belt that you have left for it, which I think is kind of cute. And in addition to some others, you've also got Kitty, and Kitty is the weird one that I was talking about. It's a sort of fleshy thing that seems very Half-Life 1 inspired, and it kind of acts as the game's grenade launcher, more or less. It fires 4 kind of bouncing sticky grenades. They bounce off of terrain, but they stick to enemies, and they're quite powerful actually, and its alt-fire is a sort of buzzsaw, like it fires out a saw blade that sort of homes in and does very high single target damage. And this one is actually refilled with blood rather than ammo. You don't find ammo pickups for it. Instead, you have to walk through the blood cloud that appears when an enemy is killed, and doing so will refill it. Another very important part of the formula for a game like this is the enemy variety, and there's actually quite a surprising amount of it in just the first episode. I played through the entire first episode that's currently available in early access, and I was surprised by the number of enemies that are actually available, and I was also surprised by the way that the game was able to make them easy to tell apart despite being just terrifying, gibbering messes of flesh and steel. Despite all looking really otherworldly and unpleasant, they also still manage to have an identifiable silhouette that you can tell them apart by, which I definitely appreciate. One thing I should also probably mention is the game has a very heavy use of dithering, which you can probably tell in the background. I'm actually a little bit terrified of what YouTube's compression is going to do to this video because of all the dithering, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And of course, the final very important piece of an old school shooter is its level design, and in this case, I was impressed. I think the level design is actually really solid in this game. They are quite varied. You know, you'll have a lot of big, wide open outdoor levels, and then you'll eventually make it to some dingy, gross underground industrial places and some ancient stone ruins and some things like that. So there's a good amount of variety in the locales that you'll be visiting, and the levels are surprisingly large and can actually get quite complex later on as well, with a good amount of verticality to them, a lot of secrets to find, and a lot of switch puzzles and things like that, but none of them are obnoxious switch puzzles. They all tend to be pretty obvious what the switch is open, so you don't have to backtrack throughout the entire level just to find the one thing that opened. You know, they're generally very well-paced levels, I found, and I never got lost. I never felt like I didn't know where I was supposed to go next or what to do. The levels are usually pretty well signposted with lighting and enemy spawns and things to help lead you throughout it, while also allowing you a good amount of space to explore and find secrets. Speaking of secrets, by the way, I was really bad at finding the secrets in this game. I found about half of them or so, which is pretty dismal for me because usually I'm the kind of guy that takes a long time beating each level because I look in every single nook and cranny possible, but I genuinely had a pretty hard time finding the secrets in this game. There are several different types to look out for, one of which is the dented wall secret, which I never ever found. The tutorial actually just gives you one straight up and says, hey, this is a secret wall, look for these. And I couldn't tell any difference from the wall between any other wall. They all looked the same to me. Between the very heavy use of dithering and the very chunky textures, I just couldn't tell a difference. I think all the walls looked the same, so I was never able to find a single other dented wall secret across my entire playthrough. But there are some other secrets to look for, like some platforming secrets where you just have to carefully and cleverly jump around the place to find some hidden alcoves and things, and there are also a lot of hidden switches and buttons and things that you can find to open up other secret passages and the like, and one of which I found actually had a reference to Caleb from Blood in it, which makes me automatically like this game more. It's the rules. But yeah, the levels are actually quite good. I would say it's probably the level design is the high point of the game, aside from its atmosphere. And they actually do a good job of meshing together as well, with the levels each having their own very oppressive, industrial, grungy, nasty atmosphere. And it gets particularly impressive later in the game when you go to some huge underground caverns and things, and of course eventually the throne itself, where all this flesh is coming from. And stuff gets real weird, and it gets really genuinely impressive the amount of atmosphere they're able to cram into such low resolution motion textures and things, everything looks so cool and really creepy, and the developer has done an excellent job of crafting a really specific kind of eldritch body horror atmosphere. The only two real complaints that I have, the two criticisms, are actually both things that the developer has mentioned that they are aware of and currently thinking about, which is a good thing. I mean, that means that even the stuff that I would say is potentially a negative is already being worked on and thought about in different ways. One criticism that a lot of people have is that there isn't really a save system in this game so much. You just save at the beginning of each level, and if you die, you go back to the beginning of the level, and since some of the levels are quite long, this can lead to you repeating the levels a lot. But as a counterpoint, I would say the game also sprinkles extra lives quite often throughout the level that will revive you on the spot with 75 health, and these kind of act like mobile checkpoints effectively, and I think that the game is actually pretty well balanced around these, and I don't mind the system at all. I pretty much never had to repeat an entire long level because I was always exploring and finding enough of these extra lives to back me up if I ever died. But the criticisms that I do have, one of them is very small. It's that the effect that happens when you feed your leech weapon, Kitty, it looks a lot like getting hit. When you walk into a blood cloud and actually get some blood ammo for it, it looks very, very similar to like a normal hit pain effect on the edges of your screen, and it can actually make it look like you're taking damage when you're actually not. So I think that effect needs to be altered a bit to make it look less like you're taking damage, but like I said, they already know about this. And the other one is that I think the game uses dithering a little bit too much. I appreciate its use of dithering. I think it adds a lot to its creepy eldritch atmosphere, but at the same time, I think it goes a little bit hard in some of the areas with the dithering, mostly in the later half of the game when you start to go underground and things get very dark and claustrophobic. The dithering combines with the dark fogginess to make everything really indistinct and kind of hard to see sometimes. I think this is probably the biggest reason why I wasn't able to find some of those dented wall secrets, was because the dithering can get so crunchy and extreme that it actually can make things a bit more indistinct than they should be. They should be a little bit indistinct because you're not always supposed to be aware of what exactly you're looking at in this game. That's kind of part of the point of its overall theme, but at the same time, visual clarity is still important in a shooter like this, and I think the dithering is maybe a little bit extreme. Overall, I think it's a really solid first episode of a very promising old-school-inspired shooter that is currently available, like I mentioned, in early access. The link will be in the description below this video if you'd like to check it out for yourself. It's only $12 for the first episode, which isn't too bad, and I'm interested to see what the second episode brings, because judging by the epilogue and some of the teaser screenshots that have been posted by the dev, it's going to be in an entirely different location with some different themes, and it should be getting more towards the eldritch side of things, which I'm definitely interested in. So thanks very much for watching. Check it out if you're interested, and I'll see you next time.